I never thought I'd cross a line so dangerous, so irreversible. But I did. And in doing so, I lost everything that once defined me. For years, I lived my life by the book. I was the teacher everyone could trust, the one parents respected and students admired. I worked hard, stayed late, poured everything I had into the classroom. It wasn't just my job, it was my identity. I thought I knew who I was. But sometimes, knowing yourself isn't enough. He wasn't like anyone else. There was something about him, his presence, his charm, that unsettled me in ways I didn't understand at first. I told myself he was just another student, another face in the sea of young lives I was helping to shape. But he wasn't. This isn't a story I ever imagined I'd tell. It's not a story I'm proud of. But it's a story I have to share, because it's about more than what I did. It's about how a single decision can unravel everything you thought you knew about yourself. You think you'll see the signs, that you'll know when you're standing on the edge. But the truth is, sometimes you don't even realize you're falling until it's too late. For years, my life had followed the same pattern. I'd wake up early, prepare for the day, and pour everything into my work. Teaching wasn't just a career, it was my world. I told myself that the long hours and the sacrifices were worth it, that shaping young minds was enough to fill the spaces I didn't want to admit were empty. But when you dedicate yourself completely to something, you sometimes forget what it feels like to be seen, not as a professional, not as a role, but as a person. I didn't notice how lonely I'd become. I'd been single for years, and I convinced myself that was by choice. Relationships seemed messy, complicated, and I had no room for complications in my life. Or at least, that's what I thought. And then he walked into my classroom. He wasn't the kind of student you could ignore. He had this presence about him, this quiet confidence that made him stand out. It wasn't arrogance, it was something more subtle, more genuine. He carried himself like he already knew who he was, like the rest of the world was just catching up. He wasn't perfect, far from it. But that's what made him real. He wasn't afraid to speak his mind, to challenge ideas, to ask the questions no one else dared to ask. And while most of the students saw me as just their teacher, a figure at the front of the room, he looked at me like I was someone worth knowing. At first, it was nothing. Just small moments that felt harmless, even flattering. He'd stay after class to ask questions, his voice earnest, his curiosity genuine. "You make literature feel alive," he said one day, his tone light but sincere. I laughed, brushing it off. "That's my job," I replied, smiling. "No," he said, shaking his head. "It's more than that. You're different." The words lingered longer than they should have. I told myself it was normal. Students say things like that all the time, don't they? They connect with teachers, see them as mentors. It didn't mean anything. But then there were the jokes, the shared laughter over things no one else seemed to notice. The way he'd light up when he saw me, the way he'd find reasons to linger just a little longer. And the way I started to feel when he did. It wasn't immediate, and it wasn't something I wanted to acknowledge. But there was a shift, a subtle change I couldn't ignore. I found myself looking forward to those moments, to the sound of his voice, to the way he made me feel like I was more than just a teacher. Like I was someone worth noticing. It was innocent, I told myself. Nothing more than a connection between a teacher and a student. I wasn't doing anything wrong. But deep down, I knew better. He had a way of saying things that stayed with me long after the day was over. Compliments that felt too personal, questions that felt too pointed. "Why don't you ever talk about yourself?" he asked one day, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. I laughed it off, as I always did. Because I'm the teacher. It's not about me. But he didn't let it go. "It should be," he said. "You have this way of making everyone else feel important. Don't you think you deserve that too?" The words hit me in a way I wasn't prepared for. It wasn't just what he said, it was the way he said it, like he meant every word. I'd spent so much time building walls, keeping my personal life separate from my work, that I didn't realize how much I'd been craving connection. And for reasons I didn't fully understand, he was the one giving it to me. Looking back, I can see the signs, the moments where everything started to shift. The way his presence became a constant in my thoughts. The way I started to feel drawn to him, not just as a teacher, but as a person. It wasn't a choice, at least not one I made consciously. It was a slow unraveling, a quiet breaking of the rules I'd lived by for so long. And by the time I realized what was happening, it was already too late to stop it. At first, I didn't see it. I didn't realize how much I started looking forward to those moments, the ones that felt so small, so innocent. A conversation after class. A shared laugh over a joke no one else would understand. But slowly, those moments became the highlights of my day. There were days when I felt invisible, when the weight of routine, of loneliness, felt like too much to bear. And then there he was, there, always present in a way that no one else seemed to be. His words felt like a lifeline, pulling me out of the quiet emptiness I didn't even know I was drowning in. He had this way of making me feel seen. Not just noticed, but truly seen, in a way I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just his words, though they lingered with me long after they were spoken. It was the way he looked at me, the way he listened as if everything I said mattered. And for someone who had spent so much time feeling like an afterthought in her own life, that feeling was intoxicating. I found myself seeking him out in small, quiet ways. Asking questions about his day, his plans, things I wouldn't normally care about with other students. And he did the same, his curiosity about me feeling both genuine and disarming. "You always seem so strong," he said one day, his tone thoughtful. "Do you ever let yourself just be?" The question caught me off guard. I laughed, brushing it off, but his words stayed with me. Because the truth was, I didn't. I didn't let myself just be. And somehow, he'd seen that. It wasn't one big moment that changed everything. It was a series of small moments, building slowly until they became impossible to ignore. One day after class, he stayed behind to finish a project. The other students had left, and the room felt quiet, the kind of quiet that sharpens every sound, every breath. We started talking, as we often did, about his plans for the future. He spoke with such passion, such certainty, that it was hard not to get caught up in his excitement. "I wish I had that kind of clarity when I was your age," I said, smiling. "You're not so different from me," he replied, his voice softer now, more serious. I looked at him, confused. "What do you mean?" "You've got that same fire," he said. "The same spark. I can see it." The words hung between us, heavy and impossible to ignore. And suddenly, the air in the room felt different. Charged with something I couldn't name, something I didn't want to name. I should have said something. I should have reminded him, and myself, of the boundaries we both knew existed. But I didn't. Instead, I felt my resolve crumbling, my carefully constructed walls beginning to crack. It wasn't just the way he spoke to me, or the way he looked at me. It was the way he made me feel. Like I mattered. Like I was more than just a teacher, more than the version of myself I'd been living with for so long. But with that feeling came something else. Guilt. Fear. The knowledge that what I was feeling was wrong, that the pull I felt toward him wasn't just inappropriate, it was dangerous. I told myself to stop. To pull away. To remind him, and myself, of the roles we were supposed to play. But every time I tried, I found myself drawn back in. There was a moment when the boundaries began to blur completely. It was late, a school event had just ended, and most of the staff and students had already gone home. He found me in the library, sorting through papers, my mind on autopilot after a long day. "You're always the last one here," he said, his voice light, teasing. I smiled, shaking my head. "Someone has to make sure everything gets done." "You work too hard," he said, his tone softening. "You deserve more." The words felt like a challenge, like an invitation to acknowledge something we'd both been trying to ignore. I looked at him, and for a moment, everything else faded away. The sound of the clock ticking, the faint hum of the air conditioning, it all disappeared, leaving just the two of us. "I should go," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "Do you want to?" he asked, his gaze steady, unflinching. The question hung in the air, a line waiting to be crossed. And at that moment, I didn't have an answer. Looking back, I wish I could say I walked away. That I found the strength to put an end to whatever was building between us before it went too far. But the truth is, I didn't. Because by then, the connection wasn't just in my head. It was real, tangible, and it had taken root in ways I couldn't ignore. And though I told myself I could keep it under control, I knew deep down that the line I was standing on wouldn't hold for long. It was only a matter of time before everything I'd tried to keep hidden came to light. It happened on a rainy afternoon. The kind of day where the world feels smaller, quieter, like the walls around you are closing in. He stayed after class to finish a project, something simple, something routine. I didn't think anything of it at first. We were sitting across from each other, the sound of the rain tapping against the windows, filling the silence between us. We talked, as we always did. About his goals, his frustrations, his hopes for the future. He made me laugh, really laugh, and for a moment, I forgot about the lines I'd drawn in my mind, the boundaries I was supposed to keep. And then, it happened. It wasn't planned. There was no build-up, no dramatic moment of decision. 1 second, we were laughing, and the next, We weren't. He reached across the table, his hand brushing against mine, and the air between us changed. It was electric, charged with something I didn't want to name. I looked at him, and he looked back, and in that moment, everything else disappeared. I should have pulled away. I should have said something, anything, to stop what was about to happen. But I didn't. Instead, I let it happen. He leaned in, and so did I. The kiss was hesitant at first, like we were both testing the boundaries we were breaking. But then it deepened, and the weight of what we were doing hit me all at once. I pulled away, my heart pounding, my thoughts racing. This is wrong, I whispered, my voice shaking. It doesn't feel wrong, he said, his eyes searching mine. I didn't know what to say. Because in that moment, a part of me believed him. I couldn't believe what I'd done. The shame hit me like a wave, crashing over me, leaving me breathless. I told him it couldn't happen again, that we needed to stop before things went any further. But the damage was already done. After that day, everything felt different. Every glance in the hallway felt like a spotlight, every conversation a potential slip. I couldn't concentrate in class, couldn't focus on anything other than the secret I was now carrying. He, on the other hand, seemed unfazed. If he felt the same guilt, the same fear, he didn't show it. He smiled at me in the hallways, lingered after class, and found excuses to be near me. And every time he did, my resolve crumbled a little more. There was a moment, a few days later, when I almost confessed. Not to him, but to a colleague, a friend who'd noticed how distracted I'd been. She asked if I was okay, if there was something going on, and for a split second, I considered telling her everything. But I couldn't. Because saying it out loud would have made it real. And I wasn't ready to face that reality. The secrecy became suffocating. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, wondering who might have noticed the way he looked at me, the way I lingered too long when he spoke. We told ourselves we could keep it hidden, that no one would find out. But the weight of the secret began to seep into every part of my life. At home, I couldn't sleep. I'd lie awake at night, replaying that moment in my mind, torn between guilt and longing. I knew what I'd done was wrong, deeply, undeniably wrong. But a part of me couldn't let go of the way he made me feel. Alive. Seen. Wanted. And that part of me, it scared me more than anything. I started noticing little things, signs that we weren't as careful as we thought. A lingering glance that lasted too long in the cafeteria. A student who seemed to watch us a little too closely. A colleague who asked me if everything was okay, her tone laced with suspicion. Every moment felt like a test, a trap waiting to spring. I was walking on a razor's edge, and I knew it couldn't last. But even knowing that, I couldn't stop. I couldn't pull away from the connection we'd built, the feelings I couldn't seem to control. And deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. Secrets have a way of slipping through the cracks, no matter how tightly you try to hold them. I thought we were careful. I told myself no one could see what was happening, that the stolen moments and lingering glances were invisible to the outside world. But I was wrong. It started with a rumor. I don't know who said it first or where it began, but whispers have a way of growing louder. A colleague mentioned hearing something unusual, students talking about me, about him. I brushed it off, laughed even, pretending I had nothing to hide. But inside, my heart was racing. Then came the message. I didn't know he'd told a friend. I didn't know that friend would tell someone else. And I didn't know that someone else would screenshot a conversation and send it to the administration. But by the time I found out, it was too late. The principal called me into their office the next morning. The tone of their voice, the way they avoided meeting my eyes, it told me everything I needed to know before they even said a word. I need you to explain this, they said, sliding a piece of paper across the desk. It was a printout of a text conversation, words I'd thought were private now staring back at me in black and white. My heart sank. I tried to speak, to find some explanation, but nothing came. My mind was blank, a blur of panic and shame. This is serious, they continued, their voice cold, professional. If this is true. But I didn't let them finish. I couldn't. I made a mistake, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. A terrible mistake. The words felt heavy, like they were dragging me down, but saying them out loud didn't make them any easier to bear. Their expression hardened. You need to leave the premises immediately. There will be an investigation. The walk out of that office, down the hallway I'd walked so many times before, felt like the longest walk of my life. Students watched, their whispers following me like shadows. Colleagues avoided my gaze. And at the end of that hallway, he was standing there. He looked at me with so much anger, so much betrayal. His hands were clenched at his sides, his jaw tight, his eyes filled with something I couldn't bear to face. Why did you tell them? I asked, my voice shaking. I didn't, he said, his tone sharp, cutting. But maybe I should have. His words hit me like a blow. I realized then that this wasn't just my mistake to carry. I hadn't just hurt myself, I'd hurt him, too. I'd pulled him into something he wasn't ready for, something he didn't deserve. And now, we were both paying the price. The aftermath was swift and brutal. I was suspended immediately, pending an investigation, though I knew there was nothing left to investigate. The truth was already out. News spread fast. Parents demanded answers. The school board issued statements. My face was on every local news channel, my name dragged through headlines that made me feel like a stranger to myself. I tried to stay home, to hide from the world, but even there, the weight of it all was unbearable. The messages poured in, some from friends, expressing shock or disappointment, others from strangers, their words sharp, cruel, unrelenting. And through it all, the one thought I couldn't escape was this: in one moment, everything I'd worked for was gone. My career, my reputation, my sense of who I was, it was all shattered. But the worst part wasn't losing my job or my name being dragged through the mud. The worst part was knowing I'd failed the one person I was supposed to protect. He wouldn't talk to me after that day. He wouldn't even look at me. And I don't blame him. I'd crossed a line that should never have been crossed, and in doing so, I destroyed something. And that's when I realized the full weight of what I'd done. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a choice that hurt not just me, but everyone around me. And there was no going back. After everything fell apart, I moved to another city. I told myself it was for a fresh start, a chance to rebuild away from the whispers and the stares. But the truth was, I wasn't running from the people who judged me. I was running from myself. But no matter how far I went, I couldn't escape it. The guilt, the shame, the endless questions that replayed in my mind like a broken record. Why did I let it happen? Why didn't I stop it before it went too far? And the hardest question of all, how do you live with a mistake that can't be undone? For weeks, I barely left the small apartment I rented. I couldn't bring myself to face the world, to even look people in the eye. Every reflection felt like an accusation, every quiet moment a reminder of the life I'd destroyed. Eventually, I realized I couldn't keep living like that. I needed help, not to make excuses, not to erase what I'd done, but to understand it. To understand myself. I started therapy. At first, it felt like a punishment, like peeling back layers of wounds I'd spent years trying to ignore. But over time, it became a lifeline. I learned things about myself that I didn't want to admit, that I'd been lonely for years, that I'd ignored my own needs until they became unbearable, that I'd looked for validation in all the wrong places. Therapy didn't absolve me of my guilt, but it helped me see the patterns, the cracks in myself that I'd tried so hard to cover up. I wrote letters, to my colleagues, to my friends, even to him. Letters I never sent, because I knew they couldn't change what had happened. But writing them helped. It was a way to confront the pain, to face the truth of what I'd done, and to promise myself I'd never make the same choices again. The consequences of my actions didn't end when I left that city. They followed me, reshaped every part of my life. Relationships I'd taken for granted were gone. Trust, once broken, didn't return. My career, the thing I'd poured my life into, was over. And I'll carry that with me for the rest of my life. But the hardest part? Knowing the pain I caused him. He was young, vulnerable, and I was supposed to protect him, to guide him. Instead, I hurt him in ways I can never take back. I'll never forget that. And maybe I shouldn't. Mistakes like this don't go away. They live with you, shadowing every step forward. But they can also teach you. They can force you to see yourself for who you really are and push you to become someone better. That's what I'm trying to do now. Not to forgive myself, but to be someone worth forgiving. This isn't a story I'm proud of. In fact, it's one I've wished 1,000 times I could erase. But no matter how much I regret it, no matter how much I want to rewrite the past, I can't. It happened, and it's part of who I am now. Accepting that, owning that truth, has been the hardest thing I've ever done. Mistakes like mine don't just go away. They linger. They change the way people see you and, more importantly, the way you see yourself. For a long time, I let the shame consume me. I let it convince me that I didn't deserve to move forward, that I didn't deserve to rebuild. But eventually, I realized something: carrying guilt without growth doesn't serve anyone. The scars of what I did will always be there. I'll always carry the memory of the people I hurt, the trust one broke, the lives I disrupted. But those scars have also taught me something. They've taught me to face myself, the good, the bad, and everything in between. They've taught me to take responsibility for my actions and to choose, every day, to be someone better. Sometimes, the worst mistakes teach us the most important lessons. I've learned how easy it is to lose your way when you ignore the things that hurt you. I've learned that seeking validation in the wrong places only creates more pain. And I've learned that redemption doesn't come from others, it comes from within. I'll never undo the damage I caused. I'll never forget the pain I inflicted, not just on myself, but on him, on everyone involved. That's a weight I'll carry for the rest of my life. But every day, I have a choice. A choice to let that weight define me, or to let it remind me to be better. And that's what I want to leave you with. Let me ask you, have you ever made a choice you couldn't take back? A mistake so big it reshaped everything? How did you move forward? What did you learn? I'd love to hear your story. Because if there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that we're all human. We all stumble. But it's how we pick ourselves back up that defines us.